Hello and welcome to Lexitecture, a podcast about word origins and histories. My name is Ryan, and in each episode my friend Amy and I bring a new pair of words to share their stories with each other and you. You can find our past episodes and the occasional blog post on our website at lexitecture.com. Follow along with us on Twitter and Facebook at Lexitecture, and if you really like what we do, you can support the show at patreon.com/lexitecture. Today's episode, Listener Wordstravaganza Part 6. Hi everybody, and that includes a whole bunch of new listeners, I think, after we had a bit of a Twitter explosion. So if you're new here, welcome. If you're old here, welcome back. Today, as you're already noticing, there's just me. Listeners who've been around a while are well aware of this and well acquainted with this phenomenon, but for anyone new, the way we record this podcast is that Amy, who lives in Scotland, and I, who live in Canada, try our best to figure out a window of an hour or two in the week where we can actually carve out some time between time zones and do the recording. Sometimes that just doesn't work, and this is one of those times. And in those times, we've asked in the past whether it would be preferable for the listeners, for you guys, if we just waited and postponed it by a week, or if we kept to our bi-weekly schedule and we do a solo episode. And the response was generally, yeah, keep it going. It's not as good as when you're both there, but it's better than nothing. So, and we appreciate that. So that's what you're listening to now. And specifically, you're listening to the 6th installment of our ongoing Listener Wordstravaganza series. So what this is our taking cues from you as far as what words to look into. Normally, Amy and I just sort of cast around for inspiration, or inspiration casts around and finds us, and then that's how we come up with the words we want to do. But every now and then we put out a call on the social meds and ask you what you'd like to hear about, or if there's a word or a phrase or something that's, one of those things that's been bugging you but not enough to actually look it up, or etc. Like, I've got tons of those where it's like, oh, I've always meant to do that, but then I just didn't. And we got a ton of suggestions. And we're also always both getting and encouraging people to send in suggestions to us, just even if we don't ask for them. Unsolicited word suggestions are great. And we do always add them to the list, so feel free to get in touch with us about that or about anything else. So without further ado, we are going to dive right in. We're going to start with a question that came in a while ago, so apologies if you've been waiting around to hear this answer, but here we are. And this came in over Twitter from at Super SuMC. They're an MC anyway, that's for sure. And the question was, why do we park on a driveway and drive on a parkway? Now, you've probably heard this question asked before. You've probably asked it before, or at least kind of thought about it, gone, that is kind of weird. And part of that, I think, might be regionalism, but we'll get into that. So I decided to run with this one and look up the words driveway and parkway. So driveway is they're both fairly straightforward compound words, as you can imagine. So driveway is a simple compound of drive and way. Now in the UK and in certain contexts everywhere, it's often shortened simply to drive. I don't think in North America we would commonly say, oh, someone's coming up the drive, but maybe in certain places, not in my neck of the woods anyway, in Ontario, in Canada. But of course, drive is a very common, street type. So, as opposed to street or road or boulevard, you have a lot of different drives. And drive is way earlier than the compound driveway. Drive came around in the OED in 1816. Driveway shows up in 1870. And it just means a way for driving, which makes sense. It wasn't until about 1884 that it is used to refer to the private road connecting a public roadway and a house. And and again, I should back up a little bit just because I try to remind myself to do this every now and then. What we're doing here in general is looking at the history of words, which is why you're here. But the history of words and the study of etymology is limited because what we have to work with is the written record. And as everyone knows, words are used all the time that get sort of poo-pooed and shunned and otherwise don't make it to the page, at least for a long time. Sometimes not really ever, but the process of developing works like the OED and historical dictionaries and stuff is painstaking and monumental. And it relies on a whole bunch of different things coming together. So first off, someone has to write it down. And second of all, it has to last, and it has to reach a level of sort of publicity. I don't know that it has to go all the way to fame, but it has to, well, in order to last for the longest time, a written work had to have a certain level of importance to at least somebody in order to preserve it. So a word has to be written down, usually long after it's coined and starts getting used in common parlance. Then it has to survive long enough. Then it has to come to the attention of the people compiling the dictionary you're looking at. And then it makes it in as an example of this sense or that of a certain word. So there's a lot of things that have to come together. And so we often, when we're doing these shows, we'll talk about, when a word shows up. And as a general rule, and in fact, as a rule, we're never meaning this is the first time the word has ever been used ever. And if that is what we're doing, we'll sort of say that. But 99% of the time, what we mean is this is when we have written evidence of it as early as, but that's a mouthful. So we say it shows up in, or the OED dates it as starting in or arriving in blank year. And so that's the shorthand we use. But I just feel like often shorthand gets used a lot. And in the in circle of that shorthand, everyone knows it. And that's fine. And that's great. And that's why sort of jargon and specific language develops in specific circles, because it's easier and because everyone in it knows what it is. The problem comes with people who don't know that necessarily. They can be unintentionally excluded and not really get what we're talking about. So that was a long tangent. Normally tangents usually happen because one of the other of us has decided to drag the other one along on one, but we can do it to ourselves as well. But so long story short, too late. When I say, drive shows up in 1816, driveway in 1870, that's a fairly large gulf. So I feel fairly confident that drive was being used before driveway. But like the fact that driveway shows up in 1870 and it doesn't mean the driveway to a house until 1884, that's only 14 years. And in the late 1800s, that, it could absolutely have meant the road connecting a house to a road. It just was nobody needed to write it down. And so nobody did. And so the earliest we have is 1884. Anyway, back to it. So, the other thing about words that make it in before we get all the way back, but this does relate, I promise, is that there's certain kind of classes, not in the sort of caste system class, but as in group. Certain groups or areas or categories of words are more likely inherently to be written down than certain other ones. Just because writing is more, especially as you go further back in history, writing is more prevalent in certain places than others as a general rule. We're generalizing here, obviously, but the, inner city houses in dense urban centers probably don't even have driveways. Certainly not a driveway that's worth giving its own name. And so it would be country estates and more rural places that have, what are sometimes an actual road. You drive a kilometer from the public road to get to the house that you're going to. So that's one of the things that, it probably developed, started to be used and refer to country estates. So there's that. And it wasn't, and so the places that did have driveways, that's where I was going with this. The places that did have driveways had driveways worth naming. So they were longer. There was an actual thing, as opposed to the inner city houses. The things that I think are commonly thought of when you think of someone's driveway, and I'd be interested to hear whether this is regional as well, but I think the idea of we park in a driveway comes from the sort of suburban setting where really what you're looking at is a short, wide parking space or a pair of parking spaces in front of a garage, in front of a house in a suburban neighborhood, your typical white picket fence, and that suburbanization came along kind of mid 20th century. And that's where driveways become kind of oxymoronic because you don't ever drive along them in those settings. I went to high school in a suburb of Toronto, and we certainly didn't drive on our driveway because there's nowhere to go. It was a parking space out front of our house, so we pulled into the driveway and parked on it, but that's why it makes it kind of oxymoronic. Anyway, parkway, on the other hand, is a compound of park and way. And this fits in with this question because you're thinking park a car. But what we're talking about here is park as in an area set aside for nature to be awesome and beautiful. That kind of park. And this one shows up in the OED as an American innovation, an American English thing in 1875. So it's kind of interesting that both of these words predate the car by a fair bit. But people drove on parkways because that was how you drove, that was the way to drive through a park. Or in kind of a possibly more accurate urban design setting, it's a drive that is meant to make you seem like you're driving through a park. It was designed to be as pleasing as driving through a park. So you get broad, grassy medians between the lanes of if it's a divided parkway, or wide lawns on either side with, trees and a shrubbery and stuff like that. So that's the park in parkway is not park as in park a car. It's park as in go to the. Now, component pieces and getting into the etymology of these things, drive, they're all very, very old words, like extremely old words in English. So drive comes from an Old English drifan, and that means to compel or urge to move, to impel in some direction or manner. And this one may go back all the way to Proto-Indo-European, and I'm going to pause here again just to do one of these explaining things. So you'll often hear us refer to the pi root that we're arriving at, and pi stands for Proto-Indo-European. It is the theorized ancestor language, common ancestor language for a whole ton of Indo-European languages that came from it. And it's sort of theorized by people going, well, that Sanskrit word and that Hebrew word and that English word and that French word all kind of sound the same and all kind of mean the same things. Like, that's weird. Maybe there's a common ancestor, and then people way smarter than me. I don't even know if Hebrew is an Indo-European language now that I say it. And someone out there is saying, no, idiot, it's not. And I appreciate you for saying that because I feel that. But the point stands and underline, and in fact, underscores the next thing I'm going to say, which is people smarter than me came up with this, and I just read about it in books and on the internet. But there's, and that's why it's also very murky, right? Because there's nobody, has ever heard anyone speak Proto-Indo-European. It's a hypothetical, theorized language, so it gets muddy at times. And in this case, there's some debate whether there is an Indo-European root for this, or whether it was an innovation later in amongst the Germanic ancestors of English. But it's very, very old either way. Park also goes back to the 1200s in English, meaning an enclosed area used as a game preserve. And there's evidence that this goes back in German and Proto-Germanic languages to the 400s. and originally might have referred to the fence around the area. So the park was the delineation of the start of the enclosed area, and then it became just the enclosed area itself. So that's park. And way is also ridiculously old, and it essentially just hasn't. This one hasn't really changed really much at all as you go all the way back to Proto-Indo-European, and the pi root is sort of spelled with Latin letters W-E-G-H, and it means to go, move, transport in a vehicle. Now, the Proto-Germanic wega or vega, depending on how W's work in Proto-Germanic, meant a course of travel, and that came down, and the way was just a path along which you traveled to get from A to B or bring stuff from A to B. So that's way. So that is why we drive on a parkway and park on a driveway. It's really a way to drive and a way through a park. And that's that. So thanks to Super Stu MC for throwing that one out there. Appreciate that. Sorry it took so long to get to your suggestion, but as they say, better late than never, I hope. Dr. Microchem on Twitter asked whether the phrase the jig is up versus the gig is up, or jig, I guess if you pronounce G-I-G, jig, which I don't, but people pronounce GIFs sometimes just because, but I'm not starting that here. But this is a one-way communication right now, so I won't hear about it till later, so I'm just going to leave it out there. In this case, however, the phrase is in fact jig, J-I-G, not G-I-G. Now, a jig, and yes, it is the dance. Well, sort of. It's sort of the dance. As early, like in the Elizabethan Shakespeare-y times of the latter half of the 1500s, a jig was, to quote the OED, a lively, rapid, springy kind of dance. But by the end of the 16th century, the OED has citations where jig had kind of become a slang word for a joke or a prank or a game or something like that. And that's actually where the jig is up comes from. So the jig is up as in the game's over, you're done, I have discovered your prank, you rapscallion, etc. So that's where the jig is up is like the dance, jig. Etymology-wise, jig is a gigantic mystery. Nobody really knows where it's from. Origin uncertain is the OED's oft-used shorthand for, I don't know, because they're much too venerable and important to just write, I don't know. But that's what they mean. There's some conjecture that it's related to an old French word for a specific stringed instrument, but the OED talks about how that's, there's problems with that. The word in French was apparently long obsolete before jig shows up in English, so that's weird. But this gets into another thing that we kind of touch on every now and then, which is the idea that, words are just noises that we've all agreed to ascribe meaning to. And we've all, for the most part, agreed on the meaning that we've collectively put on them, but they're basically just organized noise. So, and a lot of times there's this thing that we refer to as sort of onomatopoeia, but for the essence of a thing, either its action or its feel or its purpose or something like, and jig, I don't know, jig, you kind of, your shoulders go up a little bit when you jig, you kind of shrug a little bit and you sort of bounce a little bit when you say it, I think, jig. You're doing it now, aren't you? Jig, jig, and you're kind of bouncing up and down. So maybe that's where it comes from. Maybe just people just did that. Somebody made a noise. What do you call that dance? I don't know. Jig. Yes, that works. Let's call it a jig. But that's, A, the level of academic sophistication that you'll find on this show, and B, just sort of anyone's guess. But yes, Dr. Microchem, it is jig, J-I-G, not G-I-G. The jig is up. This next one comes from Dustin, also on Twitter. A lot of these are from Twitter, but we'll get to some Facebook suggestions down the road. Dustin is the host of Sandman Stories Presents podcast. He's also just an indefatigable booster of podcasts and general all-around awesome dude on Twitter. So give him a follow. But and check in on everyone else too. But he suggested the word stubble. And as soon as I read Dustin's tweet about stubble, I was like, I don't know. I've never thought of that before. I only think of it as the stuff on my face when I get lazy, and that makes my kids squirm around when I give them a hug and it gets all scratchy on their cheeks. The rough, unshorn hairs of a not quite yet beard. And I think that I've heard it referred to or used to refer to like a field that's just recently been harvested, or, an area of clear cutting where most of the trees are gone, but a bunch of stumps. But I think insofar as I have thought about it at all, which is not very far, I think I always assumed that it was, the analogy went that the field looks like a stubbly face as opposed to the other way around. And maybe that's, I am man, therefore things must be named after me talking. But I don't know. That's just how I thought about it. It turns out, like most, or like a lot, I'll be charitable to myself, like a lot of things, I think, totally backwards. The earliest citations in the OED for stubble go back to the end of the 13th century. And it did in fact refer to the lowest bits of the stalks of grain left over after reaping. So an unshorn face is like a freshly harvested field with all the cut off stalks remaining, and not the other way around. There's something kind of interesting, I mean, to me anyway, but you're here, you've made it this far, probably to you too, about the etymology of this. So the OED says that the word stubble comes from Old French stubble, and from Latin before that, stupla, or in classical Latin, stipula. But there's an even older English word, stub, which goes back to the end of the 10th century. So we're late 900s here. And it essentially refers to the same thing, the stump of a tree or the leftover green stalk. So it's basically the same as stubble, only it seems like stub was for a singular. You could have a stub. Don't trip over the stub, the way we'd say don't trip over the stump now. We refer to a singular thing, whereas stubble was more commonly like a field, a bunch of things, usually the plural. So, I don't know. Apparently it doesn't have anything to do with stipula, and therefore not really with stubble. The OED's etymology for this goes back to the Germanic side of the English family tree and just sort of stays away from Latin entirely. So it suggests that they're not connected, and they are much smarter than me, as I've said, and will say again. So that's probably right, obviously. But those of you who are listening to our 100th episode spectacular, where we had a whole bunch of also smarter than us people sending us incredibly generous well wishes and their favorite language facts, will possibly remember, but will have heard, Daniel from Because Language brought up the use of the suffix le as a frequentative. So if you can have something that sparks, but if it kind of looks like there's a whole bunch of little sparks, it sparkles. Or a crack versus a crackling sound, or a crackle. One prick versus prickle. You have a nest, but if you kind of get all cozy and you nestle. So the le as a frequentative was something he brought up, which I hadn't thought of before, but really love. And so now we have an old word, stub, and then a couple hundred years later, a word stubble. One means one stump or stalk of grain. The other means a bunch of them. So I don't know. Maybe one leftover stalk is a stub and a whole bunch of them is a stubble because of that frequentative le suffix. But maybe this is exactly how folk etymology stuff starts. And we never really shun that here anyway, because we love a good story. But yeah, I don't know. The OED goes as far as saying that there may be a connection between stub and stubble, but it doesn't say anything about the le suffix thing, and it just sort of, as a cast aside, maybe it involves an adoption of this older word stub, or something like that. So I don't know, but it's neat to think about. So thank you, Dustin, for suggesting stubble and bringing us down that particularly bumpy road. Over to Facebook. Now, in episode 93, which was another solo episode, I looked at quit, quite, and quiet, which are sometimes trip people up when they're trying to spell things quickly, popular typo destinations, but also surprisingly connected between the three of them. Following that episode, Nicole O'Hara, who has been waiting a very long time for this answer, if she's indeed still listening at all, was asking about a bunch of other kind of homonyms and nearly homophones and stuff, just to wonder if there was a connection between any of them as well. And one of the groups that she suggested was bear, bear, and bear, which is not as effective when it's audible. So two of them are B-E-A-R, and one of them is B-A-R-E. So bear as in the animal, bear as in to carry, and bear as in to not have anything on. And is there a connection between those three things? And the answer appears to be no. This is Muddy Waters should be the name of this episode, because there's a lot of this sort of murkiness around most of these. But the answer seems to be no, but I can't quite come up with anything that says concretely why the answer is no and why we know that there's no connection. So let's get into this. A bear. Now, bear contains one of my favorite little language fact nuggets. So I'm happy this came up. So bear, the large, enormous, scary, fast, furry animal, comes from bera, or yeah, I think it's bera, B-E-R-A, in Old English. And it looks like it comes from a Proto-Indo-European root that simply means the brown thing, or the brown one. Now, that is not the only Pi root. In fact, that's not a Pi root specifically for bear. It is a Pi root for brown. And there is a Pi root for the animal, the bear, which has come down to us in the word Arctic. So people who have trouble remembering which pole has penguins and which pole has bears, the Arctic has bears because it's called Arctic, as in where the bears are. And the Antarctic is the there are no bears here place. So Arctic bears, Antarctic no bears. Thus penguins. So what's the deal with the brown one then? Well, there is, in a lot of European cultures, there was, I don't know if it still is, but maybe, but definitely was, a fear of basically if you said the name of an animal, you particularly one that you didn't like, you ran the risk of summoning it. And you don't want that. Nobody wants to put bears on their town because bears are enormous and scary. I mean, they can be. Sometimes they're adorable. But that's a dice roll that I'm not making anyway. So the idea was if you said the word for bear, it could summon them and then you could have a real problem. And so, modern example, Chris Rock says Macbeth in a theater, and I mean, look where we are now. We can tut-tut about the superstitions all you want, but but the idea was they needed a substitute for the actual name for bear to say it, so they didn't accidentally summon a bear. So they called it the brown one, or the brown thing, Big Brown. And that's actually where bear comes from. It became so popular and so common to not say the word bear that we just don't really have that word anymore. And so now it's the brown one. And even for the white ones and the black ones, it's the brown one. So that's where bear, B-E-A-R, comes from. B-E-A-R, as in to carry, has basically meant the same thing since the first millennium in English. And even before that, all the way back into the Indo-European roots. And it's always meant to carry, but it also has always had the sense of to bear young, to beget or give birth to, or something along those lines. So those two things have sort of always coexisted thousands of years strong in much the same word and sound and sense. As far as bare, B-A-R-E, as in naked and exposed, etc., that comes from the Germanic side of English's family tree and from a Pi root, B-H-O-S-O, according to Etymology, that meant naked. So this is another one. Super old, super steady and consistent. It's always meant naked. So I don't know. It's interesting. The three words have always essentially meant the thing that they mean now, with the exception of that little side road that bear took to go from brown to bear. They're all very, very old. And it's sort of slightly weird that... So they're probably not actually related, but the PIE roots for the two BEAR senses are identical, and they're just assigned two different senses of that same root. So it's not very likely that, we think of bear as in the big strong animal, and if it's more than you can bear, well, even if you're pretending to be a bear, you're as strong as a bear, you can't handle it. So there's a temptation to say, well, that's how they would be related. But remember that the Proto-Indo-European root that we get bear from didn't mean the big strong animal. It meant the color brown, or a thing that had the color brown associated with it. So in this case, as much as I like a story and as much as I like to be like, oh, maybe it's, I don't know. I mean, I can't think of an obvious reason why to bear something and a thing that's brown would necessarily be the same, but maybe I'm just missing something. Now, that said, there has been a potential for a lot of confusion even over the years. So buckle up for another tangent here. The bear, BARE/BEAR confusion possibly comes up in a Sir Walter Scott book from 1822 called The Pirate. Now, The Pirate is where the first citation of the word berserker or berserk comes from, as in to go berserk. Now, this is an example where it's possible that this is the first time this was used in English, because it's adopted from a Norse word, and maybe Scott just kind of found the Norse word and said, yep, I'm going to have that now, because that's kind of how a lot of English works. And so it's possible that this actually, 1822, was the first time anyone used the word berserk or berserker in English. We don't know that for sure, but it's possible. So this comes from an Icelandic word meaning bear shirt, BEAR shirt, or someone who clothes themselves in bear hides. And, bears are large and strong and scary. And if you see someone who is wandering around wearing the skin of an enormous animal that they have personally killed, that's a good sign that, tread lightly, maybe. Like, they can mess you up, is what I'm saying. And so, because they've killed and skinned a bear. Etymology notes that in The Pirate, Scott describes a berserker as one who fights without armor. Now, Etymology takes that and goes, so this is a situation where Scott misunderstood and thought that it was the original, bear shirt from the Icelandic meant BARE, as in naked above the waist, fighting shirtless. There's a chance that that's true, I guess, but I could also see it being the case where Scott didn't consider bear hides armor. So it doesn't necessarily mean that he didn't think that it meant the animal, the bear, because if someone's walking around wearing a fur coat, you're not necessarily going to describe them as wearing armor. And so, I mean, who knows? But it's possible that even Walter Scott got BEAR and BARE mixed up from time to time. So if it's a point of confusion, it is a common and long-standing one, probably. As an aside, another one. I don't know how many hands we're on the other hand, but one last thing. If you have ever been to Edinburgh, you've seen this. If you have never been to Edinburgh, you should go to Edinburgh at least once in your life, because it is a phenomenally cool city. But in the middle of Edinburgh, there is an enormous monument. It is very pointy, very spiky, very tall, very prominent, very foreboding, and generally awesome. And when my wife and I were in Edinburgh for an anniversary trip, I could not get enough. I loved this monument immediately, but I kind of went, if anyone, I didn't know what it was for, and we had only seen it in the distance and kind of as we're wandering by. But I sort of assumed that it was for, usually big monuments are for people who kill lots of other people in the name of God and country, etc. They're usually war monuments or some such. And then I found out, I finally got fed up enough to just ask a passerby, hey, what's that? And they obligingly looked at me like I was an idiot because I didn't know what this massive monument was. And they said it's the Scot Monument. I was like, they built that for a guy who wrote? Like, that's an author monument? And indeed it was. So there are loads of reasons to visit Edinburgh, but that's also a good one because you're in a place where they built like a 10-story monument to an author, which is pretty all right. Like, I like that. I don't know Walter Scott personally. Maybe this is the longest and also fastest case of milkshake ducking ever, but that's cool, I think. That brings us to the end. Thank you, Nicole, for that suggestion. Hope that clears some things up, but probably it didn't. But that brings us to the end of this installment of Listener Wordstravaganza. I am hoping and cautiously optimistic that we are back on our regularly scheduled, both of us, podcasting schedule for next time in a couple of weeks. In the meantime, if you like what we do, this was fun for you or interesting, please do tell some friends about what we do. Spread the word on social media. Maybe before you close your podcast app, if it's got a rating section or a review, just write a couple nice things about us. That'd be pretty rad. And we will talk to you again soon. Bye. And that's it for another episode of Lexitecture. To get in touch with us about something you heard in this episode, you can email us at words@lexitecture.com. You can also follow along and talk to us at Lexitecture on Facebook and Twitter, and at Lexitecture Podcast on Instagram. For back episodes and the occasional blog post, visit us at lexitecture.com. Thanks very much, and we'll talk to you again soon.